When a little boy is left alone at a wildlife reserve, a lion notices the child crying on the road. This fearsome big cat locks eyes with the boy and roars loudly before charging towards him. What happens next is beyond belief. Scout walked in circles around the little boy, whose crying was getting louder. It was early morning and the area was empty. The huge lion Scout paced back and forth, the morning breeze ruffling his thick mane, and suddenly he stopped and stared straight at the boy. The child's cheeks were red and swollen from crying, and he looked up at the big cat with eyes full of tears. The lion lifted his head and let out a loud roar, showing his sharp teeth in an intimidating way. On the dirt road, the boy had no place to run. Scout roared again, his gaze fixed on the child, with anger flashing in his eyes. Scout had been living in the safari reserve ever since Ethan, a wildlife ranger, had rescued him as a cub. Ethan had discovered Scout curled up next to the lifeless body of his mother, who had been killed by poachers. The cub was too young to survive without his mother, so Ethan took him in, caring for him day and night, feeding him, and making sure he was safe. Ethan had worked at the reserve since he was 16 years old, so he understood how important it was to get Scout used to being around other lions before he became too attached to humans. Once the cub was strong enough, Ethan placed him under the care of a lioness who had just given birth to her third cub. This lioness was known for being fiercely protective, but also incredibly gentle, traits that Ethan believed would help Scout adapt. Fortunately, Ethan's instincts were right, and the lioness accepted Scout as one of her own. Ethan was overjoyed by this, and over the next few years, he watched Scout grow and eventually leave the pride. Male lions are known to be solitary, and stepping away from the safety of the pride for the first time is always a risky move. Ethan understood that Scout had a better chance of survival within the reserve, but there was still the possibility that he might encounter a more dominant male, leading to a fight over territory or mates. Though the lion prides were Ethan's favorite aspect of working at the reserve, he made sure to keep a close watch on Scout. Having rescued him as a cub, Ethan had a special connection with the lion and was deeply invested in his survival. However, Scout was about to do something that Ethan could never have anticipated. The lion stirred from his deep sleep as the sun began its slow ascent. Lions, being most active during the cooler hours, took advantage of the early morning to hunt. Scout's stomach rumbled softly, a clear reminder that it was time to find food. Hunting as a solitary lion was challenging, but Scout had managed to survive on his own. Yet, as he was about to set off, something made him pause. A sound carried by the morning breeze reached his sharp ears, and an oddly familiar scent drifted into his nose. Curiosity piqued, Scout followed the scent, and soon his eyes spotted a small figure on the dirt road ahead, a young child, abandoned and sobbing. The little boy, no older than 3, sat in the middle of the road, his blue jacket's hood pulled over his head. His cries were heart-wrenching and filled the air with a sense of distress. Scout kept his distance at first, circling the boy slowly, his gaze fixed intently on the child. Then, suddenly, Scout halted. A new scent reached his nose, one that made his fur stand on end. He sniffed the air, his hackles raised as he locked eyes with the tear-streaked boy. With a deep breath, Scout let out a thunderous roar, baring his sharp teeth. The little boy, startled by the fearsome sound, fell silent, his wide eyes fixed on the massive lion before him. A fierce intensity seemed to fill Scout's eyes, but the child noticed something strange. The lion wasn't focused on him. Instead, Scout's gaze was fixed on something beyond the boy. Suddenly, with a burst of speed, Scout charged straight toward the child, but instead of attacking, the lion leaped over the boy's head, landing with a heavy thud behind him. The startled child heard a terrifying sound, a deep, resonant thumping that made him spin around in fear. What he saw made his heart race. Another lion had appeared, and Scout had pinned him to the ground. Towering over his adversary, Scout let out a series of menacing roars, swiping at the second lion with his massive claws. The two lions clashed in a brief but intense struggle, their growls and snarls filling the air. Yet, the intruder was no match for Scout's strength and ferocity. Meanwhile, Ethan was driving along the dirt road, completely unaware of the incredible scene that awaited him. As he neared a bend, the ranger caught sight of 2 lions locked in combat, a sight not uncommon in his line of work, But then Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Just a few feet away from the battling lions was a small child, vulnerable and dangerously close to the lethal beasts. Panic surged through Ethan as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had no idea how the boy had ended up in the reserve, but one thing was certain: the child was in grave danger. Without wasting a second, Ethan slammed his foot on the gas pedal, sending his Jeep hurtling down the road at breakneck speed toward the boy. As Ethan closed in, the second lion, wounded and overpowered, managed to escape from Scout's crushing hold. Limping away in defeat, the intruder retreated into the bush. Scout, triumphant and still seething with protective aggression, roared loudly before turning his attention back to the child, who stood frozen. What happened next almost made Ethan crash his Jeep in shock. The huge lion lay down beside the boy, forming a protective barrier around him. Scout was watching his surroundings carefully to make sure nothing else could harm the child. It was clear now that this wasn't just a fight over food. Scout had been protecting the boy. He had fought the other lion to keep the child safe. Ethan thought about the day he had found Scout, a frightened cub, huddled next to his dead mother. Was there something about the crying child that reminded Scout of his own past? Whatever the reason, Ethan was deeply impressed. Even though Scout was protecting the boy, Ethan knew he had to act quickly. He needed to get the child off the road and figure out how he had ended up there. Ethan was worried about whether Scott would let him near the boy. If the lion was protective, he wasn't sure how he would manage the situation. Ethan turned off the engine and carefully opened the Jeep door. Of all the rangers at the reserve, he was the only one Scout trusted. As he stepped out of the Jeep, Scout watched him approach. The lion took his time examining Ethan as if deciding whether to trust him. And after a slow stretch, Scout eventually stood up and walked away. Ethan waited patiently. He knew he had passed Scout's test and didn't want to ruin things by rushing. Once the lion was at a safe distance, Ethan carefully picked up the child. With Scout no longer nearby, the boy started crying again. Ethan held the child close and drove slowly and cautiously back to the office. His mind was filled with questions. Why had the boy been left alone on the road? He was still processing Scout's astonishing actions. The fastest way to find out more about the boy was to check the CCTV footage for clues. As Ethan reviewed the footage from the reserve's boundaries, he saw something heartbreaking. An old battered car appeared on the screen just outside the reserve. Ethan could barely make out the driver as a young man. A few moments later, a young woman got out of the car holding the child. She looked around quickly, then seemed to find a weak spot in the fence. And after some effort, she squeezed through the gap with the child and set him down on the dirt road where Ethan had found him. The woman kissed the boy on the forehead and then got back into the car, leaving him behind. Ethan watched as the little boy looked around for his parents, but they were nowhere to be seen. Ethan felt more confused than ever. The kiss on the boy's forehead had been gentle and loving, suggesting the woman had no choice but to leave him. But why would she abandon him inside the reserve, where he would be at risk? Did she believe the security cameras would be monitored and someone would quickly find the child? Or did she think a ranger would be nearby to rescue him? The young man realized he might never get all the answers he sought. He was determined to do everything possible to locate the little boy's parents, but something deep down told him they were already far away. After watching the footage, Ethan prepared a meal for the child. The boy seemed to have settled down a bit, so the ranger thought it was a good moment to try and gather some information before contacting the authorities. However, the child still appeared scared, and all Ethan could manage to learn was that his name was David. It was time to make some difficult phone calls. As Ethan spoke with the authorities, he kept an eye on David, who was cautiously eating his food. When the authorities arrived, David was watching videos on Ethan's phone. And after having some food, the little boy became more energetic. He kept pointing outside and saying, "Lion," making a roaring sound, which made the young ranger laugh. Ethan asked the authorities what would happen to the child. They explained that if they couldn't locate any family members, the child would be sent to an orphanage in hopes of being adopted. It seemed like a lot of change for such a young child, and Ethan didn't want to imagine how it would impact him. Before he could fully grasp what he was doing, the young ranger impulsively volunteered to care for the child while the authorities searched for his family. It was a bold decision, one that bordered on reckless, given that he had no experience with children. But the little boy had touched his heart deeply, much like Scout had years ago. A few days later, however, Ethan received some troubling news. David's family was nowhere to be found, and the boy would have to be sent to an orphanage. The young ranger looked at the child who had already become so comfortable in such a short time. Just the day before, Ethan had taken him on a ride to see the lions, and the boy had squealed with joy at the sight of cubs playing in the grass. Ethan knew that one day David would have questions about why he was abandoned. Even though no one could ever give him a definite answer, there would be someone to tell him that his parents loved him. There would be someone who could share the story of a brave lion that protected him and saved his life. That person was Ethan. So he made up his mind. David wouldn't end up in an orphanage. Ethan would adopt him. The next few months were tough as Ethan navigated the long and challenging adoption process to become David's legal guardian. But finally, after it was all over, the new father and son took a drive to see the lions and celebrate the start of their new life together. As they drove through the reserve, they spotted Scout basking in the warm evening sun, not far from where David had been found. As the Jeep passed by, the lion noticed the little boy looking out the window at him. Scout slowly lifted his head to gaze at the man who had now rescued not only him, but also the little boy. Ethan was eager to share Scout's story with his son once he was old enough to understand. With a rescued lion and a child now part of his family, the ranger's life might seem unusual, but he wouldn't want it any other way. Now it's your turn. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's place? We would love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.